This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is Gretchen Kershaw, Vice President of Strategy and Chief Operating Officer for Power Sector Consultant Grid Strategies. Gretchen is going to describe Volume 1 of Grid Strategies' federal transmission pricing, the evolution of current policies and practices. And she's going to drop a teaser for the just-released Volume 2, Options for Ensuring Affordability and Reliability in an Era of High Load Growth. Gretchen joined Grid Strategies in February of 2025 after serving as Senior Advisor on Transmission in the Biden Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. Before that, Gretchen was Federal Energy Regulatory Commission legal advisor to Chair Richard Glick, and then managing attorney and senior legal advisor to the Commission's General Counsel. So she's got a wealth of background and information knowledge to bring to this subject of federal transmission pricing. Gretchen, let's start with an overview of this work. What is the cooperative federalism that the paper says governs the U.S. transmission system? And why is it that transmission cost allocation and cost recovery, as determined by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, can shape the build-out and affordability of the transmission system expansion the U.S. urgently needs?
Well, first of all, Herman, thank you so much, and USEA, for having me on the podcast today and for elevating this very important topic near and dear to my heart. I am a self-professed transmission nerd and a FERC nerd, so I think this topic is very interesting and exciting, but I've come to appreciate that not everybody feels this way. I do want to start, though, by just hitting home the reality that anyone in the energy space, especially anybody who's working on issues around load growth, around the grid, around AI, around affordability, they really need to pay attention and to dive in here. We're continuously hearing how data centers and other large loads want grid connection, they want access to cheaper resources, they want reliable service, and that the lack of transmission is a key constraint to getting that. At the same time, the politics of electricity, right? We're in a new era. We have candidates at the local, state, federal levels. They're all spinning why rates are up, how to fix them. I live in DC, and it's in our primary election all about electricity rates and who has control over them. So we set out to prepare this report, the first volume, really focusing on the history, the evolution of federal transmission pricing, looking at what the status quo is with a goal to help inform policymakers, stakeholders, everyone grappling with these issues, and really lay the groundwork for the ability to innovate, to do smart policymaking, and also to just, at least from my perspective, not overlook why we allocate and recover transmission service costs the way that we do, and make sure that we're not throwing out really good policy, and we're really looking for what is ripe for reform. So just want to give that overview.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you started with that preface, Gretchen, because I think the time is coming very soon that when they say transmission nerd, whether they're talking about me or you, it's going to be with respect.
We're finally going to get the respect we deserve.
But
That's great.
Tell us about cooperative federalism.
Absolutely. So federal transmission pricing is governed by the Federal Power Act. The Federal Power Act divides authority between FERC and the state regulators, and this establishes that framework for cooperative federalism in this context. And so I just for fun, I went back to my political science 101, what is cooperative federalism, to see sort of how does it fit today. And I think it's really interesting. It talks about that division between federal and state governmental authorities. That's what we know and think about all the time. But it also talks about collaborative interaction to solve common problems and administering public services. And I think that's really important because that's what we have here. We have FERC and the state regulators operating in overlapping spheres around transmission cost allocation and cost recovery, and we have a public good that is electricity. And we don't always think about it that way, but I think that's really important here. So essentially, the Federal Power Act creates a two-step process for transmission pricing. first, FERC allocates transmission costs to wholesale customers. So that's usually the load serving entity, the utility that delivers electricity to our homes and businesses. And then the states actually incorporate the costs that FERC has approved into retail rates that we pay at again, the home and business level. And this is important because regardless of how the costs are allocated and recovered at the wholesale level, the rates charged to retail customers in most cases are decided by state regulators. So no matter what is done at the federal level, states will continue to play a critical role in determining how transmission costs are distributed, especially when we're talking about data centers and these large load customer classes. So it really is an important split between the federal government and the states. And then anyone who's following this issue knows that states are already updating their policies, especially the ones that are facing a lot of data center growth. They're adopting retail large load tariffs with things like minimum commitment requirements, consumer protection, essentially features. But there are many questions that are made at the federal level. We may see some of those questions answered, or at least more information about them in the coming weeks as FERC acts on open dockets. But it will be much longer before we sort of have a dust settling and we know what the new paradigm is. And there's one last point I want to make on this question is transmission costs are not a monolith in terms of what drives them, who pays for them, and how they are recovered. And that's something that we tried to address in our report, but I want to give a little bit of a flavor here, and that is transmission that is in a single transmission owner's territory or zone is planned and its costs are allocated differently than transmission that is planned across a region. And similarly, transmission that is triggered by a new generator interconnecting to the system, that transmission is planned and its costs are allocated differently than local and regional transmission. So just to sort of double click on this point so that anyone thinking about how to create policies around this, transmission owners and regional operators are not planning and allocating costs the same way across the country. So we have a very complex system. It's not uniform across the country, and it may not even be uniform within a single state.
Interesting. Yeah, we have a very complex regulatory system, and it balances, in some ways it does balance federal and state power. That's I guess the upside, but at the same time it does make things more complex. But I want to ask you a question. I was just reading a brief by the former chair of the Connecticut Commission, Marissa Gillette. She wrote it for the American Economic Liberties Project, and she was talking about how Congress can direct orders to FERC to do things that can, like you say in your work, shape the build out and the affordability of the transmission system as we need it to expand these days. Do you agree with that? That Congress has some leverage there over FERC, so there's a third player here?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Congress is the overseer and does, haul FERC commissioners into as part of oversight. And obviously Congress is actively considering new legislation around transmission and certainly around large loads as the administration is involved and interested in this issue. Congress is involved and interested in this issue. So yes, there's a lot of players at the federal level who are dipping their toes in and figuring out what the best policies are here.
So your volume one of this transmission pricing subject is very thorough. And one of the things that it provides is a look at how we got here. In other words, how we got to this situation where FERC has a role with others in establishing pricing. Tell us a little bit about the evolution of FERC's authority, the federal authority on pricing. There was a series of orders that you mentioned in the paper, 888, 2000, 2003, 890, 1000. Each one of those orders we know has a big history and a big volume of debate about it. But just give us an overview so that we can understand the context of the big question about pricing that we're going to be taking on because of load growth. So just a little bit about this evolution and history of FERC authority.
Sure, and I appreciate you saying it's thorough. That is a word that I like to use in describing my own law review style writing sometimes. Not perhaps not typical grid strategies, but I do recommend everyone read the footnotes. A lot of good stuff in there. But thinking about the evolution, sort of going back to the beginning, there were thousands of utilities planning and operating on their own islands, their service territories, and transmission service was part of what we call a bundled sale. And that's because it bundles the transmission, generation, and distribution component into one single sale. And this is still very common outside of RTOs in the West and the Southeast. But the first regulation was from states around transmission pricing, and it's all cost of service based. So that means the utilities would recover the cost of providing their service, including the transmission service, as well as a rate of return sufficient to attract future investment. That's essentially the precedent around that. And that is still the foundational principle in electricity pricing at both the federal and the state levels. So when FERC's predecessor, the Federal Power Commission, was created, federal regulation began to increase. We're still cost of service based, but federal regulators really began to focus on increasing the access to the transmission system for the non-transmission owners. So either another transmission owner with a different territory connecting or third parties selling generation. And so the FERC required the unbundling of transmission. So I'm putting air quotes, but you can't see them. But we went from our bundled generation transmission distribution to now there's a transmission product separated out, and we need a rate for that. And that really started in Order 888, a really foundational order at FERC, required open access transmission service under open access transmission tariffs, if you've heard of those, the OATs. So from this point, transmission pricing evolved across the orders that you mentioned, Order 2000 on RTOs, Order 2003 on generator interconnection, Order 890, coordinated transmission planning, transparency, and then Order 1000, which gets you to regional transmission planning and cost allocation. But the common thread sort of across all of these orders was the increased push for broader system planning, increased generator competition, as well as FERC really adhering through all of these orders to remedying the potential for undue discrimination in transmission access. So that's just a really important foundational principle that guides a lot of these FERC orders. And so today we have this, as I mentioned, complex, multi-layered transmission pricing scheme shaped by both federal and state oversight with increasingly sophisticated methods for allocating costs and doing cost recovery. But there are three sort of enduring FERC principles that I want to point out here that you see across this full evolution. First, rates must reflect to some degree the cost of providing the service. So that's that cost of service basis. It's still the same today. Second, rates must be just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential. That's what the Federal Power Act says that has to guide FERC's rate making. And then the third one is that transmission is really specific to transmission. Transmission cost must be allocated roughly commensurate with estimated benefits. And that's a sort of clunky phrase, but it's repeated throughout court precedent. And it essentially means that those who drive the need for or benefit from transmission investments have to share in the cost. And this is the distillation of what's called the cost causation and beneficiary pays principles. They're real cornerstones of federal transmission pricing and federal transmission cost allocation, especially.
I've read much of the work that you did here, and it's so thorough, as you said, as I said, as we both have said. I didn't think that it would be possible to distill it so clearly. Those principles, I've been reporting on transmission, FERC actions on transmission, trying to get interstate transmission, trying to get a national transmission system. We've talked about all these things, Gretchen, and underlying all of the challenges to do all of these really practical things with our transmission system are those three factors. If we could just come to terms with those three factors, I hope our listeners can appreciate what a brilliant summation that was. I want to move on. I want to try to get into how all this history shapes how prices are set today and which regulators set them. You've talked a little bit about it already. I want to talk about this idea of incremental or marginal cost-based transmission pricing, which I hear a lot about, but is not at all common, is what you say in your paper. But ultimately, what I want to ask you is one simple question. What do you think is the right way to handle transmission pricing?
Well, that's a great question. If only I had a clear answer to that one. But let me start with a little bit of what is an embedded cost rate? What's an incremental cost rate? What's higher of pricing? There's a lot of things being thrown around, which seem like ancient history and now are very much in the present day around this topic. So as I mentioned, right, the transmission pricing began and still is really about the cost of providing the transmission service. And so, at first and still largely today, the cost of service was based on the what's called the rolled in embedded cost of the electric system operated by the utility to serve customers in its franchise service territory. So that rate is called the embedded cost rate, and it's established with what's called the transmission revenue requirement. But just to break that down a little bit, embedded costs are all the costs that go into providing transmission service. So poles and wires, transformers, employee wages, administrative costs, all of that, all of those costs that you have to incur as a transmission owner to provide the service. So those total embedded costs are divided by the total served using the system. So the total demand or load that's served using that system, and that creates the embedded cost rate, which is the average cost to provide transmission service based on the cost invested in the system spread across all of the customers. That's the common pricing regime. Then you compare that to what's called the incremental cost rate. So the incremental cost is the marginal cost of serving a new customer. So what it would cost to add one more unit of service today. And in the transmission context, that's typically mostly based on the cost of the transmission upgrades that have been triggered by a new service request by serving a new customer.
Can I just interrupt you for a second,
Yeah.
Kirsten? That is, I'm glad you broke that out like that because what I want to point out before you finish your explanation is that that cost to serve that new customer is fundamental to all the talk about transmission queues and how much generation is waiting in transmission queues. Am I right about that? You don't have to explain it too much because we do. I want you to continue with what you were saying, but am I just right about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is that incremental cost is charged. I mean, that's what I was going to say. Actually, the primary place where incremental cost pricing is used today is in generator interconnection context, where the incremental costs are those network upgrades identified through the generator interconnection process and assigned to the interconnecting generators. All right, so sort of thinking about how incremental and embedded cost pricing fits with transmission, where does it come up today? We actually have to go back to 1994. FERC issued its seminal transmission pricing policy statement. It is still sort of the guiding principle, guidebook, handbook on transmission pricing. And FERC, in that pricing policy, established the option for transmission providers to charge, again, in the unbundled transmission service context, charge new customers the higher of the embedded or incremental cost rate. And really important here, FERC did not require that the higher rate be charged. It gave the option to the transmission provider to decide which one to charge. And this is called higher of or pricing. And so here, what we're really thinking about and thinking about where higher of policy applies, this is largely for the bucket of transmission costs that are associated with what's called local transmission. So the cost of regional transmission, which is planned and selected under the FERC regulated regional transmission planning processes, those costs are generally allocated and charged separately, at least in the RTOs where regional transmission is happening. So here for this higher of policy, it's really about that transmission planned and built by the local transmission owner in its own service territory. So essentially, transmission providers get a new request for service or an increased need for transmission service from the load serving entity serving a large load customer. It triggers the need for transmission upgrades. Under FERC's policy, the transmission provider has the option at that point to charge the higher of the embedded or incremental cost rate. In reality, as you mentioned and we talk about in our report, transmission providers rarely choose the incremental cost rate, even if it's higher. And this is due to complexities around implementing that and filing requirements at FERC. And so, as I mentioned, it's mostly just in generator connection processes. So the incremental cost pricing has a theoretical appeal. It's being talked about a lot these days. What I want to touch on next is actually more in the second volume of our report than the first, but it's a little bit of a preview about some of the pitfalls with incremental cost-based pricing. Sometimes it's called direct assignment. It sounds nice. It's in the ratepayer protection pledge, right? Make large loads pay for their costs. But it's honestly, it's not as easy as it sounds. Not that it can't be done, but I do want to just identify some reasons why there's complexities that aren't being fully appreciated. One is it's very challenging to determine incremental cost. So FERC requires the transmission providers to show that the cost would not have been incurred but for the new customer. So it's a really high bar, and it has led to years-long interconnection delays on the generator side. So that's what we're talking about here. Second,
People litigating the definition of the price. But for litigating that phrase, but for, right?
absolutely, yeah. The second is if the transmission provider determines the incremental costs, determines the rate, they have to come to FERC and file that individual incremental cost rate for FERC approval. They have to provide cost support like they provide for any rate case to establish their embedded cost that they would charge to everyone just for that one individual customer. And so the incentive is not in favor of a utility doing this, right? That's why they don't take advantage of it. In fact, FERC recently rejected an incremental cost rate filed by a utility for data center load, due in part because of the failure to provide sufficient cost support. So it is a real hurdle and barrier to doing this. And then the third one I want to note is just understanding the risk of cost shifting in two different directions with incremental cost pricing. And so first is that if you charge 100% of the incremental costs to individual customers, that can give other customers a free ride on that transmission to the extent that the benefits flow beyond that single customer. And the other side, charging other customers for the embedded cost without charging any embedded cost to the new customer, allows the new customer to free ride on the existing system despite benefiting from it. And this latter point I find particularly concerning because I really see the opportunity for leveraging new large loads to spread the fixed costs across a larger pool. Everybody talks about the ability of large loads to drive down rates. That only could happen if they are contributing to embedded system costs. So I think that there's a major benefit that is lost if there's no contribution to embedded costs from these large loads. So that will bring me finally to Herman, your actual question. What's the right answer? I think that what I really get to is there is no one size fits all approach. That's why I wanted to give the introductory remarks that everything is different. There are different circumstances across the country. I do think states have the most significant role to play in making sure the transmission cost driven by large loads and that large loads benefit from are allocated to those customers at the retail level. But I do think there's a federal role. I especially think, and this is in our second volume of our report, really focused on addressing the front and back end timing considerations. So when do the costs begin to flow? Who pays for them when? And how long do they pay for them? Those are really big questions that I think have a federal role. And the last thing I'll say, and then I will stop, is that the thing that worries me the most is that we are going to upend progress that we have made for years, moving towards more efficient, cost-effective, large-scale transmission economies of scale for customers over fears about rising demand, and that we're going to make really bad policy choices where we don't leverage large loads to upgrade and modernize the grid, and the result will be a less reliable, more costly system for all customers and not just these large load customers.
That's twice you knocked my socks off it, Gretchen. Yes, it's balancing out all those factors is going to be a real challenge, and it's going to be something that will take lots more podcasts to get into. I was going to ask you, I keep thinking about my friend Hannes Pfeifenberger, who's a brilliant observer of all these processes at FERC and with regard to transmission. And he used to tell me, all you have to do is allocate all of the costs to all of the people who benefit. And it's a simple explanation, but I guess what you're saying is it's simple to say and very difficult to do. Would that be about right?
I think that's right. And some of the difficulties do come from the fighting and not from the actual technical difficulty. So it's a bit of a blend of both technically challenging because these are very complex network systems, as well as complicated because people like to fight over money. And that's what this is largely about.
And money and control. That's a whole subject, other subject. So look, I was going to ask you, the last question was going to be, I want to mention that the next volume, I want to mention again, volume two, just released, and it's called Options for Ensuring Affordability and Reliability in an Era of High Load Growth. Those are all terms that have become front of the mind right these days. And I was going to add, it seems like you've already thrown out the teasers for volume two. Is there anything else you want to add? I'm going to be talking to one of your co-authors about volume two, and you probably know a lot about what they're going to want to talk about. Is there anything that we should be watching for in what they tell us when I have that second podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I will start with a couple things that I wanted to point out. One is we mentioned generator interconnection, but this report is focused on transmission. I do want to make clear that generation, so the supply side itself, is often larger dollars, typically a larger portion of customers' bills than transmission. That's something to keep in mind. This is just about the transmission component of the bill. The other thing is that attributing electricity price increases to one driver is overly simplistic. There are many factors at play. They're different across the country. And then the last thing is just sort of hitting home that we only have the opportunity to drive down rates by spreading fixed costs. If we are efficiently siting large loads, we're minimizing needed upgrades, we're maximizing the grid itself, we're cost effectively planning the expansion, and if we get rate making right. And so that's why this is important, is all of the big picture flashy words that people are using about large loads. They only happen if you get wonky and you read all 100 pages of volumes one and two. That's the only way you can get at least the rates right on the transmission side. So I do encourage people just for that reason. And I will say in the teaser, I'll just say that we essentially bucketed the options that we explore. They're not meant to be exhaustive. They really are part of a discourse. But we have four categories, and I'll stop there on my teaser. But we have a category that's really focused on the timing of funding. I noted that. I think that's really important. So we have some options that are all about that. Then we have options that are focused on local transmission. Then we have options that are focused just on regional transmission and cost allocation for regional projects. And then we do have in our last category bigger, innovative changes to the system, sort of the paradigm in way in which we plan load and generators that would require a lot more changes, but also have significant opportunities.
Right. There's so much there. We're out of time. I just want to say one more thing. For all our regulators and all our regulatory staff that listen, you cannot at any time any longer say that this is too complex and you don't understand it, because Gretchen and her friends at Grid Strategies have laid it out. Go read their papers. I want to thank my guest, Grid Strategies Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Strategy, Gretchen Kershaw. She's presented just a terrific overview of Grid Strategies' new work on how federal transmission pricing can lead to strategies that improve electricity reliability and affordability. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.